What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to Redonkulous Gaming. Today we're going to talk a little Brewmaster Monk, and we're going to go with the Night Fae Covenant. Now, if you're not familiar with what the Night Fae Covenant brings you, we'll zoom out from Brewmaster for a second, and we'll talk about the signature ability for the Covenant. And that signature ability is Soul Shape. This is where you turn into a Vulpin, and you teleport 15 yards forward, granting 50% increased move speed, and that lasts for 12 seconds. Or indefinitely if you're in a rest zone. Now, while you have Soul Shape up during the course of that 12 seconds, after your initial cast, you'll be able to get 2 more teleports out during that time. So it is something that is really nice to move around relatively quickly, depending on the fight that we're talking about, or even if you find yourself stuck in combat, you can't necessarily get out and you're just trying to push the dungeon forward. It's something that's really nice to have in your toolkit. As far as Brewmaster Monk is concerned, I have just a few comments around Soul Shape. I will say that I think it's really neat that they've kind of announced that your Soul Shape can look like animals other than Vulpins. I think that's neat. That's something that is more class identity. Some of the things that Blizzard is going for when you choose your Covenant. However, with Roll or Chi Torpedo, and just the general ability for monks to get from point A to point Z relatively quickly, I don't know that you're necessarily going to pick your Night Fae Covenant just for the signature ability, which is Soul Shape. So that's not really what these videos are for. More so, I want to evaluate the ability granted to your class, and in this case, that is Feline Stomp. And if you have not seen my other tanking videos where we've done similar evaluations, I really look to answer 3 questions. The first question is, how does Feline Stomp feel? How does the ability feel to play with? Is it a fun skill to cast? Is it something that I look forward to personally while I'm playing Brewmaster? The next question is, what does the strength of the ability look like? Is it something that I feel as though is strong enough to do all the types of content that I would like? Is it something that I feel like could use a little tweaking between now and launch? And the hope is that Blizzard still does quite a bit of tweaking, but odds are we're not going to see much tweaking to the skills themselves. It's very likely just going to come through the conduit system at this point in time. Now, the last question that I look to answer kind of feeds from the second question, and that is the overall viability of the Feline Stomp, the class skill that you're granted. And what I mean by viability is that I know that I'm going to be spending a majority of my time in game playing PvE content, which includes Torghast, which includes dungeons, which includes raids. So those primary 3 content time spenders are how I'm going to be spending my time in game, and I want to make sure that my Covenant is one that allows me to do really all 3 at a very high level. So I want it to be viable across more than one type of content. I don't want to pick something just because it's stupid strong in Mythic Plus, but is suddenly crazy weak when it comes to time to raid. So that's certainly not what I'm going for. I know that's not what Blizzard wants, but right now that's kind of the reality with some of these abilities. I also do not take into account the ability strength in conjunction with conduits. I already mentioned that I feel as though Blizzard's going to be making a ton of changes to conduits. I really think that this is something that's going to persist once the Shadowlands goes live, is that they're just ultimately going to be tweaking things through the conduit system to try to balance them. So I think it's going to be a never-ending balance game for Blizzard. I think it's going to be relatively tough for them to do, but I tried not to pair these abilities with their conduits for the main reason and the sole purpose of just evaluating the abilities themselves, just the baseline abilities. So that's the way that we're going to go about this. So let's go ahead and jump in. As far as what Feline Stomp actually does, it is something that is on a 30-second recharge. So first and foremost, there's your cooldown. This is where you strike the ground with blue swirlies or a Faeline, and this essentially makes the blue swirlies cast Breath of Fire on all of your enemies as a Brewmaster Monk. It has other effects depending on whether or not you're a Mistweaver or Windwalker, but for the sake of this video, we're talking Brewmaster. So Breath of Fire is cast. If you're not familiar with the effects of Breath of Fire, this is actually going to give you some passive mitigation All of your targets are gonna do less damage to you as long as they have Breath of Fire active on them. And so that's something that, you know, is a nice passive thing that you're seeing by casting Feline Stomp. But the way that the ability works and the way that you can kind of min-max this thing, right, is you need to be able to stand in Feline Stomp. So you need to position it in a way that you can ultimately end up standing in it in conjunction with the mobs that you're hitting. The reason for this is that every time you cast a spell, or every time you hit a skill, you have a 6% chance of resetting Feline Stomp. So you can get another cast of it off almost immediately, or have it ready to go for the next trash pack or whatever it is that you're doing. So 6% chance of resetting it, which feels pretty fun. So that is Feline Stomp in a nutshell. Now let's go ahead and answer our 3 questions. And we'll start with, first and foremost, how does it feel? I will say that of all of the Brewmaster or the Monk abilities in all 4 Covenants, Feline Stomp actually feels like it fits the best from a rotational perspective. It's something that I feel as though is a button that fits in very nicely with the current rotation and doesn't make you feel like you're sacrificing one thing just to get your Feline Stomp down. It also minimizes the need for you to hit Breath of Fire on cooldown. It's still something that you're going to be doing anyway, but it's nice to just kind of have that option where if Breath of Fire is on cooldown and then you have someone ninja pull another pack on accident and you're not able to get Breath of Fire up again, if you Feline Stomp that group, you're able to go ahead and get Breath of Fire on the other pack, and that'll allow for, as I mentioned, some passive mitigation right there just by casting Feline Stomp. So as far as the feeling of it, it feels pretty darn good because it's more rotational than anything else. It's also pretty fun when you look at it aesthetically. It's kind of neat to see the blue swirlies on the ground and knowing exactly where they are. It stands out. There's high contrast in all the dungeons that are out right now. You know exactly where it is. It's pretty hard to lose it unless you're standing in a Night Fade Death and Decay. But for the most part, it's a relatively fun ability and aesthetically appealing to look at. When it comes down to the ability strength, there is one major drawback that really gets to me, and that is if you've tanked as a Brewmaster in the past, or if you've even been doing testing for yourself on beta, you'll know after just 1 or 2 dungeons that it's not all that difficult to keep Breath of Fire up on your enemies at all times. So the passive ability that you're getting from Feline Stomp is inherently invaluable as a result of the fact that Breath of Fire is so easy to keep up on your targets. I think if Feline Stomp were to provide another passive ability, or to provide, you know, maybe an increased cooldown or a decreased cooldown to some of your brews, or do something just maybe a little bit different just by standing in it, you might get a little bit more out of Feline Stomp. But as it stands right now, it's Breath of Fire that it's granting, and as I said, that's going to be situationally valuable. It's not likely going to be something that you absolutely need. If anything, it's just going to help with overall uptime of Breath of Fire, and that's about it. So the overall strength of the ability, while it's fun and rotationally sound, the strength is not necessarily where I feel like it could be. As far as the viability of Feline Stomp across multiple pieces of content, this is where it gets kind of fun to start to tear it apart, because I feel as though if I were doing something like Torghast, or if I were doing something like Dungeons, I'm actually going to be getting more value out of a Feline Stomp than I would if I were, you know, doing single target or boss or raid type content. The reason for that is that I already mentioned it's very easy to keep up Breath of Fire on your main target in a raid. It's very, very easy to do that when there's just minimal number of things joining the fray. If you don't have ninja pulls or anything that is situationally something that you need to be aware of, Feline Stomp starts to lose its value, and it becomes just more of a pretty sparkly thing that's on the ground from a Brewmaster perspective. There's obviously value if you're evaluating the Covenant as a whole for a monk across the other specs. But again, for the sake of this video, we are strictly talking Brewmaster. So the overall viability, I think, ends when it gets to raid time, and you start to look at your general uptime capabilities around Breath of Fire on a boss or a single target mob. And that's where the viability question mark kind of rears its ugly head, and I start to say there may be a better alternative to the Covenant for your Brewmaster. So that's Brewmaster Night Fae in a nutshell. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know if you agree, disagree, or if you have other trains of thought that you'd like to share.